In 1975, Andy Warhol, a well-known visual artist, reflected on his surroundings and stated, "They always say that time changes things, but you actually have to change them yourself." The me decade was bangin'. The 70s was a time of American optimism when it came to both peace and prosperity. This historical peak of individualism changed the pace of film, fashion trends, music, and technological innovation. However, it was also a time of economic and governmental struggles, as well as the fight for the equality of multiple marginalized groups. With so many outer influences and time for self-improvement, the people were in sync with Warhol and prioritized fixing Americans' problems at the root, the individual.
Staying alive, staying alive. Staying alive.
In the 70s, movies were released that probably the most of you have watched. Exactly, Star Wars, released in 1977, and also Jaws, released in 1975. Both of these movies changed people, of course, but both of them also changed the whole movie industry as well, to the movie industry we know and love. Summer blockbusters became a thing, publishing movies at the right time and in many theaters at once, using an extremely big budget for the productions and the irreplaceable special effects. Movies weren't the only thing that changed people, though. TV shows had a great impact as well. Two especially groundbreaking shows were The Mary Tyler Moore Show and All in the Family. The Mary Tyler Moore Show showed women that women can be strong despite of sexism. All in the Family dealt with cultural issues like no other show did, and discussed taboo topics like Watergate, Vietnam, or equal rights.
Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy?
That is how one of the most famous Queen songs, released in 1975, starts. And it is still listened to today, almost half a century later. In general, there were a lot of good musicians and bands in the 70s. Queen definitely being one of them, but also Elvis Presley, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, AC/DC, the Jackson 5, with Michael Jackson, and ABBA, and that is only a small percentage of the 70s bands and musicians. The 70s changed music. During the 60s, music was mostly about peace and love. In the 70s, bands changed it to the rock we know today. Bands added sizzling guitar riffs, made it okay for girls to play, and changed the way music was recorded. Without the advancements that happened during the 70s, the music would not be what it is today. Bands like the Spice Girls would have never been founded. There wouldn't be any music festivals like Coachella, and the music with all its effects and artists we know today would not be there because all these things started in the 70s and inspired people to make music themselves.
Vietnam protests came from small beginnings within groups of intellectuals, but as television stations began to air death tolls and footage from the war zone, more and more people began to get involved. The climax of the protest took place at Kent State when on May 4th, the Ohio National Guard opened fire for 13 seconds on student protesters. The public was outraged because not only were American families losing young men, but now 4 college students had been lost. Vietnam comes to a dramatic end when on January 23, 1973, American soldiers had to evacuate Saigon. And in order to make room for the Vietnamese who were fleeing, helicopters had to be thrown into the ocean.
In this art piece, you can find Nixon. This is referencing the Watergate scandal. At the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., during the early hours of the morning, on June 17, 1972, there was a break-in. It involved the then President Nixon and some of his men who helped him run for the re-election. It was quickly covered up with a few $100,000 to the burglars to stay quiet about their connections to the government. After an onslaught of publicity, conspirators began to crack under the pressure and ended up testifying against the president to the grand jury. They also told the public that Nixon had everything he and others around him had said taped. Some believed that Nixon had a right to keep the tapes to himself, whereas others thought he had a part in Watergate. On August 5, 1974, Nixon released the tapes, which proved with little of a doubt he had a hand in the Watergate scandals, as well as missing audio of what seemed to be incriminating evidence.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Soon after, Nixon resigned. This scandal deeply affected the American public, who began to look closer at their politicians.
Houston, we have a problem.
NASA's Apollo 13, launched April 11, 1970, was intended to be the third mission to land on the moon, but instead gained infamy for being a near-disastrous failure. About 56 hours into the mission, one of the two main oxygen tanks burst, also damaging the second, which began quickly venting oxygen into space. Electrical systems failed, and the astronauts had to go without food, water, or heat. The temperature dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew avoided tragedy by working with Mission Control to create an adapter out of plastic bags, cardboard, and tape to attach CM canisters to the LM system, and they were able to make it back to Earth before running out of oxygen. The astronauts, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes, touched down safely in the Pacific Ocean on April 17th, 6 days after the launch of the rocket. This mission was a reminder of the perils of space travel and a feat of amazing scientific and mechanical ingenuity. The incident renewed interest for many Americans in the space program and led to important technological advancements in spacecraft.
Hey, have you ever heard the phrase, "there are no rules in the fashion game now"? This was widely used among the staff at Vogue in the early 70s. Bright colors, bell-bottoms, wild patterns, and miniskirts were all the stoke to emphasize individuality and stand apart from the crowd. As technology advanced, so did the efficiency and mass production of clothing, which increased fast fashion and the ability to express through appearance. Both genders engaged in the tight top and loose bottom look, but females opposed conformity and adopted the casual chic look and began sporting tracksuits, sneakers, and jeans. Saint Laurent and Halston, who were both influential fashion designers at the time, became aware of various cultural shifts and designed clothing lines to appeal to the masses.
Intel invented the first programmable processing chip, the 4004, in 1971. It was only 2 inches, very small even by today's standards. Yet it only had 2,300 transistors then compared to the 560 million in chips today. The 4004 could run 1,200 programmable calculations per second. But in 1976, the Apple startup began in the garage of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. They combined the processing chip and the microcomputer and made their tabletop calculator. It was bright and colorful with a plastic case. Wozniak was behind lots of the tech, but Jobs was behind a lot of the commercial success. The location of the garage in the Bay Area went on to heavily influence the location of Silicon Valley. We chose to do some groovy hair with totally mod styles to represent wallpaper from the 70s. With big hair to the max. And this girl is like looking good. And going from left to right in chronological order, whatever that means, dude, sounds far out to me. And look, all the events the other dudes talked about are in the hair. Rad.
Going nowhere.